So what is fuzzy cognitive mapping? Now you can hopefully kind of see how it fits into the greater whole of the project. But what exactly are we doing? What are you doing this week? Well, fuzzy cognitive mapping is sort of mapping a perception of reality. It's not a map of reality, it's a map of a perception of reality, which is quite different. So FCM models can tell us what our knowledge system indicates will be caused from a particular intervention or any given set of initial conditions, together with the uncertainty associated with this inference. Which means once we have a kind of FCM map or model developed, we can actually look at that and run scenarios to understand, according to an individual or a group's perception of a reality, what would change if different components changed. And I will talk about all of this in much more detail. So let's sort of back up a bit. Maybe you're familiar with mind maps, which is something that you see here. Mind maps are sort of intuitive and hierarchical. So you see one kind of central concept in the middle, in this case, solving global warming, doing something. And then you see branching areas coming off of it in different colors, and these are sort of thematic, right? So we might talk about travel, the black branch at the top. There are different ways, different modes of travel, but there's also different results of traveling, right? Sort of bad travel, don't fly, CO2, etc. This is somebody's idea of things that could be done to address climate change. And all of these sort of relate to this central node. They're about someone's knowledge and understanding of an issue. And fuzzy cognitive maps are actually similar to this in some ways. So we can think of it like this. Perception is a lens through which we view reality. So in this picture, you have a bunch of people all looking at the same map, right? But they're all looking at it from their own perspective. They're all looking at it with their own knowledge, their own background, their own expertise, their own experiences influencing what they're seeing. So what they perceive from this experience is individually different than the fact that we just have a map on a table that everybody's looking at. So our perceptions actually influence how we focus on, how we process, remember, interpret, understand, synthesize, decide about things, and act on reality, which makes this very important, right? One of the critiques of FCM is that it does not map reality, it only maps perception. But since our perception is how we make decisions, perception is actually quite critical. So when we do this, when we perceive something, our tendency is to assume that how we perceive reality is an accurate representation of what that reality truly is, right? We think we can believe what we think, but it's not. And the problem is that the lens through which we perceive is often warped in the first place, maybe by our genetic predispositions, our past experiences, our knowledge, even our emotions, our preconceived notions, our self-interest, or even cognitive distortions. So Daniel Kahneman, who was a psychologist who received the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics, he actually created a sort of cottage industry by identifying what he termed cognitive biases. There are hundreds of these, and these are sort of systematic ways in which humans create subjective social reality that really deviates from objective reality. So for our purposes, it's very important to remember that we're mapping perceptions of reality rather than sort of getting drawn into the idea that we might be mapping reality. I've proved this, or to understand this a bit better, it can be useful to look at this image. So this is an image that some of you may recognize and some of you may not recognize. But if you would all think of the first word or phrase that comes to mind, I think you would see that we would all have very different responses to the same image. And this is because we're all unique. It's also about the way our sensory information, in this case visual sensory information, is organized, interpreted, and sort of consciously experienced. So if you want to take a moment and sort of do a round and mention the first word or phrase that comes to mind in this image, you can do that now, and you can just pause the video and go make a round and see how similar or different your first thoughts, first impressions, first perceptions of this image are. Okay, so if you've done that, I think it's also critical to understand that the differences are because perception is about bottom-up processing as well as top-down processing. So when you are in the field interviewing people about their perceptions, they're telling you about the way they're understanding something that's happening, whether it's happening around them, something they observe, or something they've experienced in a different sensory way. So bottom-up processing refers to the fact that perceptions are built from this sensory input. So that is what's coming in through our visual, auditory, tactile senses, how we experience the world, right? On the other hand, how we interpret those sensations is also influenced by our available knowledge, our experiences, and our thoughts. And this is called the top-down processing. So where these two meet is where perception comes from. So how can we make it short and sweet? Perception is a process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions in order to give meaning to their environment. Why is it important? Why are we interested in it in this work package? It's because people's behavior is based on their perception of what reality is and not on reality itself. So the world that is perceived is the world that is behaviorally important. And what factors are influencing perception? We have the perceiver, who is the respondent in your case, and they have attitudes, motives, interests, experiences, and expectations, of course. The target, which is, in our case, the field that is being discussed. So what we're trying to understand with our main interview question, which is, of course, related to novelty, motions, sounds, size, background, proximity, and similarity. And then we have the situation, which is you as an interviewer asking someone as a respondent about an issue. And this will be in a certain place at a certain time. You will have a certain connection with this person. So the time, the work setting, and the social situation are all factors in this. So fuzzy cognitive mapping measures a perception of reality, or identifies a perception of reality. So it is a qualitative modeling technique representing a cognitive network or system, and their concepts are connected by weighted directional relationships. This probably sounds very confusing. Basically, FCM models a dynamic complex system as a collection of concepts and cause-effect relationships between the concepts. And I'll show you an example in a minute. It should become much more clear. Cognitive mapping was introduced as a method to model complex systems that reflects how stakeholders understand cause and effect relationships or influence relationships. So later, after the introduction, fuzzy cognitive mapping combined cognitive mapping with artificial neural networks, known as ANN. And this has resulted in the unique capacity to capture and use the qualitative data to perform quantitative analysis and study system behavior in response to changes of system elements. So what this means is that we have, from a qualitative interview, almost a semi-quantitative data set that we can analyze. And we can also run scenarios because of that, which is what is meant by studying system behavior in response to changes of system elements. So let me show you an example. This is an example from a very recent FCM that was done with one of our colleagues in Twente. And he's originally from India, and he was discussing the idea of moving or migrating because of increasing drought in an area in India that he's very familiar with. So this is what he developed. So what you see are these sort of white boxes, right? And these are the concepts. So these are the words that he mentioned according to his perception of this issue. You also see arrows connecting these. So there are red arrows and there are blue arrows. You'll see a positive and a negative. And the negative on the red arrows means that is a negative relationship, negative influence. And the blue is positive. So what do we mean? If you look at health of cattle, there's a red arrow towards death of cattle. And how you can understand this is that there's a negative influence. If the health of the cattle increases, there's a negative influence on the death of cattle. So that means it's a bit tricky because it's a double negative in this case, but if the health of cattle increases, there's a negative influence on the death of cattle, meaning there's less death, meaning more cattle survive if the health increases. So let's look at another one. If we look at water availability for cattle on the left side of the FCM, you see a positive blue arrow going towards the proximity to cattle care. So if water availability increases, then the proximity to cattle care increases. And this is according to a sort of complex situation that in this case the respondent was analyzing. But you can see that basically what we're talking about at a macro level is concepts and their relationships with each other. And these relationships are weighted. In this case, weighted only positive and negative, but as you'll see, we can actually weight these numerically, which means we can also analyze it quantitatively. So in this example from Diana's work in India, you can see that it's also possible to aggregate or bring together individual fuzzy cognitive maps into a single map that tells a story about a larger community or a group of people and their perceptions. In this case, their perceptions about the impacts of extreme weather events on street life in India. In this example, you can see that various issues were mentioned by people, and these are sort of themed and color-coded according to those themes. You can also tell by the size of the circle how often that issue was mentioned. So, for example, the issue of flooded roads is red, but that circle is larger than the red circle indicating traffic jams, which means for our purposes that flooded roads were mentioned much more often than traffic jams. So in the next film, we'll look at actually conducting an FCM interview, and we'll see precisely what the protocol is in terms of how you go about finding a respondent and following through until you actually have a valid FCM map that you can use at the end of the interview.